So it's the last day of term, my last Inside the Lords for 2021. Um, this time last week, I thought that my week would be dominated by the police and crime bill. And if you remember, I talked about how I'd had a liaison with the Lib Dems. This week has been evidence that political liaisons don't last, because my political love affair with the Lib Dems absolutely ended because we had Omicron and all the restrictions come into place. And in fact, the week in Westminster has been dominated by attitudes to and debates about the restrictions that have been put in place by the government. You know, on Sunday evening, when you get a Prime Minister doing that address to the nation, it changes everything because it bypasses Parliament, it makes the nation think, oh God, something serious is happening, and it's completely anti-democratic, as we know. And the way that it took the form that it took here was that there was hardly a big debate in the House of Commons on Tuesday, but a debate in the House of Commons in which the Labour benches were absolutely empty for most of it. And they just were going to go along and vote with the government. Incredible. And on Wednesday, we were actually debating legislation that had been brought in that morning, including vaccine passports. I want to apologise to all those people that I said, I don't think they'll bring in vaccine passports, because guess what? I was wrong. They brought them in, even if they have renamed them in order to avoid accountability for that fact. And in that debate, just to note, the Lib Dems that spoke before me, every single one of them talked about being on trains or tubes where there were people without masks, and how they wanted to demand of the government that those people were arrested, policed, and dealt with. I mean, when it came to my speech, I slightly altered it in order to point out that the Lib Dems, who basically had said we should not be talking about freedom at this time because this is a public health emergency, were neither liberal nor democratic. And I was followed after my speech by a Lib Dem who stood up and talked about his immunocompromised position because of his chemotherapy or because of some illness that he has. In which case I did think the whole of society cannot be organised, reorganised, closed down, shut down based on the very ill. I have every sympathy with the very ill, but I wish that the government had concentrated on thinking who is most vulnerable. We know that we're all going to get this new variant because it is rampaging its way around the world. But we also know from the lived experience of where it started, or not where it started, but where we became aware of it earliest in South Africa, that so far, so good, it has not been a very serious illness. And thankfully, in a country like the UK, where people are largely vaccinated, and anyway there's 92% antibodies floating around the place, hopefully people won't become too ill. And all that debate about the variant was to be a discussion on, can you at least take other consequences into account? Can we just have a sense of proportion? Not, that you sit there and go, oh, we've got a new variant, we won't do anything if you're the government. But that you actually weigh up the pros and cons. You do a balancing act. You give people a sense of the risks, and you give people the opportunity to take action themselves, which they would be capable of doing. And that those people who are most vulnerable could, if they wanted to, shield or take appropriate action. And if you have family members in that situation, you'd act accordingly. But they just don't trust the public at all. So it is incredibly frustrating. And in terms of the House of Lords, I found it very difficult that the health minister, who is, liberal by instinct, he said himself in his summation that he considers himself a libertarian, was still prepared to put that to one side and just say everything has to be reorganised around a public health issue. And we now know the collateral damage of the restrictions. We've seen them in the way that abuse has been not detected. We see them in the way that the people's jobs and livelihoods have been affected. And now basically the hospitality industry is taking yet another hit. Labour's solution to this, by the way, is to say they should all be paid for taking the hit. It never dawns on them that they might want to oppose anything. But the biggest thing that I wanted to say about the Labour Party was the Labour Party spent all of their time talking about the NHS heroes, frontline workers. They make a point of making those rhetorical points, and yet they voted for the mandating of vaccines for health workers, completely and totally selling out quite a tens of thousands of workers in the NHS. And I was glad in the House of Commons to see the Corbynistas, Jeremy Corbyn for once. But quite a few of them just said, no, actually, we're not going to be that anti-working class, and did have a bit of principle, and a couple of their PPSs resigned. And it was good to see, because it's a rarity. But the majority of the Labour benches in the House of Lords nodded it through and basically lectured the rest of us as though we were irresponsible. And the other thing to say is, because it's not said often enough, and I didn't say it in my speech, is that we know that the groups of people who are vaccine hesitant cover a whole range of types of people, but we do know there's a disproportionate number of people from ethnic minority communities who are reluctant to take the vaccine for whatever reasons, and I would want to encourage them, and that's a different question. But what that effectively means is that many of the people who will be sacked or denied access to nightclubs are from minority communities that everybody goes on and on about protecting all the time. Nobody seems to want to take that into account, and for the Labour Party to not take that into account is atrocious. It's actually one of the reasons why the Corbynistas actually noticed that and said, you know, we don't want to be seen to be discriminating. Even if it wasn't from ethnic minorities, the idea of a two-tier society is abhorrent. Anyway, that's my rant on that question. The police and crime bill has actually carried on, but none of the big issues have really raised their heads, so I've actually decided that I've spoken so much that I'd keep a lid on it slightly and let people who were more appropriate speak out, because the issues around the protest parts of the bill actually won't come through now until January, and so there'll be plenty for me to get stuck into then. And also there's the new nationality and borders bill coming up in January, and whilst I really believe that control of borders is very important and national sovereignty is very important, citizenship is dependent on having control of your borders. I think that the way that Priti Patel has organised this nationality and borders bill is very problematic, and particularly the right of the Home Secretary to remove citizenship. So I will be probably having an alliance with the Lib Dems again. I mean, God, politics is confusing. So that'll be the first day back on Wednesday the 6th of January. I really hope that you all have a happy Christmas. I've learnt a huge amount about politics this year from being in the House of Lords, so even though the House of Lords should be abolished, it's been quite good as a learning journey, and I hope that I've shared some of it with you. One amusing thing that I've learnt is I've learnt some of the rules that and ways of being that presumably happen in public schools that I'm not used to. So last night, for the first time, I went to what is called long table. I didn't know what it was either. And it's basically a long table in which you have to kind of literally kind of sit just where you are on the table, so you can be sitting next to anyone. And this is a way of creating a collegiate atmosphere. And you have to talk to the people next to you and by you, and they can't ignore you. I have to say that when I sat down, the two Lib Dems opposite to me nearly had a heart attack, and it ruined their Christmas as I ate my Christmas dinner, and they weren't very collegiate because I just attacked them. However, actually, I did meet, interestingly enough, a number of people and had interesting conversations, and it was a great Christmas dinner, a bit sort of school dinnery actually, which meant I loved it. But I was sitting next to this gentleman who I sit opposite in the Lords, and I sort of, you know, an earl of something, and he's a nice little man, and we had a chat and all the rest of it. And then somebody said to me, well, he does look like his grandfather, isn't he? Anyway, he's an Attlee. And he does actually look like Clem. I thought, oh, that's who he reminds me of. Anyway, there we go. You meet the most extraordinary people. He's a prison reformer, apart from anything else, and he always makes interesting points. But there I was, chatting away. So I felt part of the whole history of British politics sitting next to him. And I do actually think that there are some extraordinary figures and characters here. And sometimes I accuse this place of all sorts of things, but I don't want to imply that there aren't some people in here who are not just well-meaning, but actually do some pretty all-right stuff. What I've also learnt, though, is that the heart of politics will never be within Westminster. The heart of politics for me remains outside of Westminster, and I still hope that what I've managed to achieve is to make these little films and expose some of the issues that go on and bring it to life. And I thought you'd be amused to know this, that apparently these little films and the fact that Ella helps me and puts up the clips of my speeches every time I speak in there, have increased the social media interaction for the House of Lords substantially. And that a number of other peers have realised that maybe they ought to be thinking about what the public think, and have also started putting up clips of their speeches. And I think that makes a difference, because although we're not elected, if you suddenly think that possibly somebody in the public might be listening to you, not just the people who you're head of the trust of a charity and you want to kind of impress them by dropping the name in, which people do all the time, but that actually possibly the public might be interested, then I think it changes the nature of how you behave. And I hope that I will have this faux accountability throughout 2022, because it will make me always remember that A, the only reason I'm in there is because of anything that I was doing in the public sphere, either with the Brexit Party or the Academy of Ideas, and B, because who the hell do we think we are, right? We're not lords of the land, right? We are just accidentally in there because we were appointed for a variety of reasons. But if we're going to be there, we have to remember that the only reason why Westminster has any power at all is with the consent of the voters and the consent of the public, the consent of the citizenship of this country, and it's them to which we owe the privileged position in which we are, even if we weren't voted for. And if the public decide to abolish the House of Lords, I'll be all behind them. I hope you have a good Christmas. I hope you won't be too frightened of this new variant. I think it's going to rampage through the community, and hopefully people won't get seriously ill. But I do know that the greatest fear at the moment is of those press conferences and Boris coming on, because I think that when I talk to people, they're not so scared now of the virus as scared of government restrictions. And I really hope that you manage to still have great times and great fun. Josie Appleton wrote one of our letters on liberty, on the broad consequence of the way that this pandemic has been dealt with socially, and she gives it a historic perspective. It's absolutely brilliant, 2,500 words. If you haven't bought your stocking fillers, do get this package of letters on liberty. Particularly read Josie Appleton's contribution. It's on the one time so timely, on the other hand a little depressing, but on the realistic thing is we have to understand what's happening to us and not be victims of it. We can't fatalistically let things occur to us without really getting to grips with it. So I found it actually exhilarating to read it, because it helped me understand the world that we live in. The Academy of Ideas is having our Christmas party tomorrow, and I can't wait. All sorts of people are coming. Sorry you haven't all been invited, but what I mean is we intend to carry on socialising with each other, because without that kind of solidarity, without that sense of us being a collective, there's just no point. You know, I might be alive, but if we're going to be socially isolated from each other, physically being alive is not good enough for me. I want to live, and I'm sure you do. And I don't just mean live and be free from disease. I mean live a life in which we are able to exhibit what we are best at as human beings, which is to be creative, to be history making, and to be change makers. And that's what I'm going to do, and I hope you will too. And in the meantime, just have a bloody good time. Cheers.